My name is Penelope. I am 34 years old, and I sat at the center table of a chandelier-lit country club in Chicago, surrounded by 66 prominent guests. We were supposed to be celebrating my rehearsal dinner. Instead, my future mother-in-law slid a 40-page legal document across the silk tablecloth. "Sign it right now, you gold digger," she announced to the silent room. "You bring absolutely nothing to this family." I did not cry. I picked up the pen, read her absurd demands, and then calmly opened my own black folder. By the time I was finished, my future father-in-law was hyperventilating in the back of the room. I was about to show them exactly what I brought to the table. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a family who completely underestimated your worth. Growing up, I learned early on that wealth often spoke loudest when it was trying to hide something. The Oakwood Country Club was the epitome of Chicago old money. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over arrangements of white orchids and imported roses. Waiters in crisp white jackets moved silently between tables, pouring expensive champagne into delicate crystal glasses. It was a world of curated perfection. I sat at the head table wearing a modest vintage dress I had found at a local thrift store for $40. Outside in the valet lot, my 10-year-old Honda Civic sat parked between gleaming sports cars and luxury sedans. I knew exactly how I looked to these people. I looked like a charity case. I looked like a woman who had won the lottery by landing a man like Preston. Preston was 35. He had the kind of polished, handsome face that belonged on a magazine cover, and a family pedigree that opened doors across the city. His mother Barbara made sure everyone knew it. From the moment I met her, she had treated me like an unfortunate blemish on her perfect family portrait. She constantly reminded me of my modest background, making pointed comments about my unbranded shoes or the fact that I drove an economy car. She loved to brag to her socialite friends about Preston's incredible generosity, letting a struggling girl like me live in his luxury downtown loft. I never corrected her. I just let her talk. I always believed that people eventually revealed their true character if you simply gave them enough silence to fill. That night, I was going to find out exactly how deep their cruelty ran. Dinner had been a tense affair. The room hummed with the quiet conversations of 66 guests. Most of them were wealthy investors, business partners, and high society friends of Preston's father, Richard. I had spent the evening politely answering condescending questions about my little job and smiling through passive-aggressive compliments. Preston sat beside me looking incredibly handsome in his tailored suit, but he had been uncharacteristically quiet, downing his wine rather quickly. I thought it was just pre-wedding jitters. I could not have been more wrong. As the waitstaff began clearing our plates to prepare for the dessert course, the clinking of a silver spoon against a crystal glass cut through the ambient noise of the room. The conversations gradually died down as all eyes turned toward the head table. Barbara stood up, smoothing her designer gown. She possessed a commanding presence, radiating the kind of arrogant confidence that only came from decades of unchecked privilege. I smiled politely, expecting the traditional rehearsal dinner toast. A few words about love, perhaps a funny story about Preston growing up. Instead, Barbara reached down and lifted a thick stack of papers from the empty chair beside her. The thud it made when she dropped it onto the silk tablecloth echoed in the silent room. I stared at the document. It was a prenuptial agreement, a 40-page legal contract bound in heavy blue paper. Barbara did not offer a warm smile. She did not raise her glass to toast our future. She simply placed her perfectly manicured hand on top of the document and pushed it firmly across the center of the table. It slid until it hit the base of my water glass, coming to a halt directly in front of me. The entire room went dead silent. I could hear the faint sound of traffic from the street outside, but inside the dining hall the air felt heavy and suffocating. "Sign it right now," Penelope, Barbara said. Her voice was not quiet. She did not whisper. She projected her words so that every single one of the 66 guests could hear her clearly. "You are not marrying my son without signing this prenuptial agreement." I looked from the thick document up to Barbara's face. She was smirking, a look of pure triumphant malice dancing in her eyes. I waited for her to say it was a joke. I waited for Preston to stand up and intervene. But the silence stretched on, thick and oppressive. "We all know why you are really here," Barbara continued, her voice booming across the room. "You bring absolutely nothing to this family. You have no assets. You have no pedigree. You drive a beat-up car and wear second-hand clothes. My son has been generous enough to let a struggling girl like you live rent-free in his beautiful downtown loft. He has given you a taste of a life you could never achieve on your own. But I will be damned if I let a gold digger secure a permanent claim to our family wealth. I want your signature on that paper before a single piece of cake is served." The humiliation was designed to be absolute and overwhelming. I could feel the collective gaze of the room burning into my skin. 66 pairs of eyes watched me, waiting to see if I would crumble. A few of Barbara's closest friends murmured to each other, hiding cruel smiles behind their wine glasses. I heard someone at the back table let out a soft, mocking laugh. They expected me to burst into tears. They expected me to run out of the country club in shame or desperately beg for their approval. I looked at the heavy document sitting in front of me. Then I looked at Barbara, who stood tall with her chin raised, waiting for my surrender. She wanted to strip away my dignity in front of her entire social circle, to remind me that I would always be an outsider in their opulent world. But I did not shrink away. I did not shed a single tear. I just sat there perfectly still, letting the sheer audacity of her actions settle over the room. My silence seemed to unnerve a few of the guests, but Barbara only looked more satisfied, misinterpreting my calm demeanor as paralyzed fear. She thought she had me cornered. She assumed my silence meant I was defenseless. She thought I was an unassuming girl who was desperate for a wealthy family to take care of her. She had absolutely no idea who I really was, or what I was capable of doing to her precious family. The real show was only just beginning. I prepared to deliver a lesson they would never forget. I turned my head slowly toward Preston. For the past 3 years, he had played the role of the devoted partner flawlessly. He had charmed my friends, held my hand through difficult days, and promised me a future built on mutual respect. In that suffocating dining room, with his mother standing over me like an executioner, I expected him to be my shield. I expected the man I was supposed to marry to stand up, push that insulting document away, and tell his mother that she had gone too far. Instead, I watched as Preston shrank into his chair. He would not even meet my gaze. His eyes darted nervously around the room, taking in the judging stares of his family and the wealthy investors he so desperately wanted to impress. His jaw clenched, and he reached for his crystal glass of scotch with a slightly trembling hand. He took a long, slow sip, letting the silence stretch until the ice cubes clinked softly against the glass. The sound was deafening in the quiet room. I was hoping I would just fold so he would not have to deal with the fallout. I waited, giving him every possible chance to do the right thing. "Preston," I whispered, my voice steady but quiet enough that only he could hear. "Are you going to say something?" He finally turned to look at me, but there was no righteous anger in his eyes. There was only cowardice. He leaned in close, bringing the scent of expensive cologne and alcohol near my face. His breath was warm, but his words chilled me to the bone. "Just sign it, Pen," he whispered, his voice a frantic low hiss. "It is just to keep the peace. You know how they are. Do not make a big deal out of this tonight. Do not make a big deal out of it." He wanted me to sign away my dignity and my future, just so he would not have to endure an uncomfortable dinner. The betrayal hit me harder than Barbara's public insults. Barbara was exactly who I always knew her to be, a vicious, status-obsessed woman who viewed people as stepping stones. But Preston was supposed to be my teammate. In that single whispered sentence, the illusion of our relationship shattered completely. He was not a partner. He was a spineless boy, terrified of losing his mother's approval and his family's money. He was throwing me to the wolves simply because it was easier than fighting them. He chose his comfort over my dignity, and in doing so, he signed the death warrant of our relationship. As if sensing Preston's capitulation, the room began to shift. The heavy silence broke, giving way to a low murmur of voices. The extended family and affluent guests sensing that the prey had been cornered, began to relax. A few tables over, I heard a sharp, condescending snicker from one of Preston's aunts. A wealthy business associate sitting near the front covered his mouth to hide a laugh. They were enjoying this. To them, I was just Wednesday night entertainment. A poor girl from the wrong side of the tracks getting a harsh reality check from the city's elite. Barbara soaked in the crowd's reaction like applause. Her chest puffed out and her smile widened into a predatory grin. She reached into her designer clutch and pulled out a heavy gold-plated fountain pen. She stepped closer to me and placed the pen deliberately on top of the blue binding of the prenuptial agreement. It made a sharp clacking sound against the table. "Take the pen, Penelope." Barbara commanded, her voice echoing through the dining hall with renewed arrogance. "Do not make this harder than it has to be. We all know you are not going to walk away from the lifestyle my son has provided for you. So be a good girl, sign the paper, and we can all go back to enjoying our expensive dinner. You can even have an extra slice of cake to celebrate your new understanding of how things work around here." Another wave of laughter rippled through the guests. Preston shrank further down into his tailored suit, staring intently at his empty plate. He was completely checked out, waiting for me to surrender so his comfortable life could resume. They all waited for the tears. In their world, a woman in my position had only two options. I could break down crying and run out of the country club in shame, or I could lower my head in defeat, pick up the pen and sign my rights away, just to stay in their wealthy orbit. I could feel the anticipation in the room. They wanted to see me broken. They wanted to witness the exact moment I surrendered my pride and accepted my place at the absolute bottom of their social hierarchy. But I did not cry. My heart rate, which had been pounding furiously just moments before, suddenly leveled out into a slow, calm rhythm. The fear and shock evaporated, leaving behind a crystal-clear sense of purpose. I looked at the gold pen resting on top of the document. Then I looked at Barbara, whose triumphant smile was starting to falter just a fraction. I did not shrink away. I did not avert my eyes. Instead, a slow, genuine smile spread across my face. It was not a defensive smile or a nervous grimace. It was the smile of a woman who knew she held all the winning cards in a game her opponents did not even realize they were playing. I reached out with a steady hand and picked up the gold pen. It was heavy and cold against my skin. "Oh, thank God," Preston muttered under his breath, exhaling a long sigh of relief. "Good girl, pen. Just sign on the last page. We can talk about it later when we get back to the loft." I ignored him completely. Keeping my eyes fixed on Barbara, I pulled the thick prenuptial agreement toward me. I did not flip to the signature line at the back. Instead, I opened the heavy blue cover and turned to the very first page of the legal text. "What are you doing?" Barbara snapped, her voice losing a bit of its booming confidence. "Just sign the back page. We do not have all night to wait for you to read legal jargon you cannot possibly understand." I smoothed the page down flat against the table, making sure it was perfectly straight. "Oh, I think I understand it perfectly, Barbara," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the quiet room. "But since you felt it was appropriate to bring this up in front of 66 of your closest friends and business partners, I think it is only fair that we all know exactly what I am signing. Do you not agree?" A nervous murmur swept through the room. The sheer audacity of my standing up seemed to paralyze the head table. Barbara took a half step back, her perfectly manicured hands twitching at her sides. She had expected a weeping victim, but she was suddenly faced with a woman holding her own trap up to the light. The waiters who had been hovering near the kitchen doors froze in place, holding trays of untouched food. Even the string quartet in the corner of the dining hall, which had been softly tuning their instruments, completely stopped playing. The silence was absolute. Preston sat up straight, his eyes wide with sudden alarm. "Pen, what are you doing?" he hissed, reaching out to grab the document. "Stop it." I smoothly pulled the paper out of his reach. "Transparency is important, Preston," I replied brightly. "Especially when family legacy is on the line." I stood up from my chair, holding the open document in one hand and the gold pen in the other. Preston looked as if he was going to be sick. He tugged nervously at the collar of his dress shirt, his face pale and sweating under the warm light of the chandeliers. Please, Penelope, he begged, his voice cracking with panic. Just sit down. You are making a massive mistake right now. You are going to ruin everything. I looked down at the man I had spent the last 3 years loving. He looked so small in that moment, so entirely devoid of character. I am not ruining anything, Preston, I said calmly. I am just reading the terms of our beautiful future together. I turned my attention back to the crowd. Many of the guests were investors who prided themselves on sharp business acumen. They watched me with a new, curious intensity. I cleared my throat and looked down at the dense legal text. I decided right then and there that if Barbara wanted a public spectacle, I would give her a show she would never forget. I focused my eyes on the first major clause of the agreement, prepared to expose the sheer ridiculous greed of the family that was trying to humiliate me. The heavy silence felt like a physical weight pressing down. I cleared my throat and let my gaze scan the first page of the document. The legal jargon was dense and designed to confuse anyone without a background in corporate law. Fortunately for me, reading complex financial contracts was exactly how I had spent the last decade of my life. I found the first major stipulation tucked neatly away under a section labeled as spousal contributions. I raised my voice, ensuring that every single person in the country club could hear me perfectly. According to subsection 4, paragraph B, I began my tone, conversational and bright. I agree to surrender 80% of all my future income to Preston as retroactive cohabitation rent for the duration of our marriage. I paused. The sheer audacity was almost impressive. Barbara had not just wanted to protect her family wealth, she wanted to ensure that I would remain financially enslaved to her son forever. She wanted to guarantee I would never build a safety net of my own. I looked up from the page and met the eyes of a wealthy investor sitting at the table nearest to the front. He chuckled softly, swirling his expensive wine. The rest of the extended family joined in a wave of cruel, condescending laughter rippling through the room. In their minds, I was just a girl who bought her clothes at thrift stores and drove a car that was barely worth $1,000. They assumed that 80% of my future income would barely be enough to cover his monthly golf club membership. They thought Barbara was simply swatting away a minor nuisance, making sure the gold digger knew her place. They had no idea that my actual income could buy this entire country club in cash. I waited for the laughter to die down before turning to the next page. The thick paper rustled loudly in the quiet room. Preston shifted uncomfortably in his seat beside me. He reached out and tried to put his hand over the document, but I smoothly pulled it out of his reach. "Let me finish, Preston," I said sweetly. "I want to make sure I understand all these generous terms you and your mother have prepared for me." I looked back down at the contract and found the next devastating clause. Section 7, paragraph C. I read aloud, my voice echoing off the high ceilings. In the event of a divorce, I agree to waive all rights to any assets purchased jointly during the marriage, regardless of my financial contribution. Furthermore, I agree to vacate the primary residence within 1 day without any claim to equity or relocation assistance. I looked directly at Barbara. Her smug smile was beginning to tighten at the corners. She had wanted to humiliate me by forcing me to sign the document in public, but she had not anticipated that I would actually broadcast her sheer greed to her peers. She wanted me to cower in shame, not read her malicious handiwork like a public service announcement. Some guests who were not directly related to the family shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A few business partners exchanged raised eyebrows. It was one thing to protect family assets, but these terms were predatory. Yet her socialite friends continued to snicker. They whispered to each other behind their hands, clearly enjoying the spectacle of the poor girl realizing she would never get her hands on the family fortune. I let my eyes wander over the faces of the 66 guests. These were people who prided themselves on their intelligence and their ability to read a room. Yet not a single one of them realized they were watching a predator play with her food. They saw my worn leather tote bag resting on the floor and my simple vintage dress, and they made their final judgments. They assumed my calm demeanor was just a desperate attempt to hold on to my pride before I inevitably caved to their demands. Preston leaned closer to me, his face flushed with embarrassment. Penelope, please, he hissed through gritted teeth. Everyone is staring. You are making us look ridiculous. Just sign the paper and we can put this behind us. I looked at him, feeling a profound sense of relief wash over me. For months I had harbored tiny lingering doubts about whether I was being too harsh in my assessment of his character. I had wondered if maybe beneath his weak spine and his desperate need for his parents' approval, there was a man who actually loved me. But seeing him now begging me to accept financial ruin, just to save him from a few minutes of social discomfort, erased every single doubt I had left. He was not a victim of his family toxicity. He was a willing participant. He was perfectly happy to let me be destroyed, as long as his comfortable life remained intact. I turned my attention back to the document, flipping through the remaining pages with deliberate slowness. I read clauses about morality, clauses about weight management, and clauses about social obligations. Each one was more insulting than the last. I read them all in my head, memorizing the depths of their arrogance. I was giving them enough rope to hang themselves, and they were eagerly tying the knot. The dining room was thick with a suffocating tension that seemed to press against the glass windows. Barbara crossed her arms over her chest, her designer gown shimmering under the chandelier light. "Are you finished, Penelope?" she demanded, her voice sharp and impatient. "We have a beautiful dinner getting cold in the kitchen. You have had your little moment of rebellion. Now be a good girl, pick up the pen and sign your name so we can all move on." I looked down at the gold-plated fountain pen resting near my hand. It caught the light, gleaming with the promise of wealth and status. I picked it up, feeling its weight between my fingers. Preston let out a heavy sigh of relief next to me, assuming I was finally surrendering. Barbara uncrossed her arms and smiled, a cold, victorious smirk settling on her face. I held the pen over the signature line. The entire room held its breath, waiting for the final stroke of my submission. Instead, I calmly brought the cap down and snapped it over the nib of the pen. The loud, sharp click echoed through the silent room like a gunshot. I placed the gold pen down on the table. Then I placed both hands on the heavy blue prenuptial agreement and pushed it firmly across the silk tablecloth. It slid back over to Barbara, coming to a halt directly in front of her perfectly manicured hands. The document remained completely unsigned. Barbara stared at it, her face dropping in shock. Preston gasped beside me, his face draining of color. I ignored them both and reached into my worn leather tote bag. I bypassed my thrifted wallet and pulled out a sleek black legal folder of my own. I set it firmly on the table, smoothing my bare hand over the sleek cover. "I simply cannot sign this document, Barbara," I stated clearly, my voice ringing out with absolute authority. "Because it directly conflicts with the very real legal notices I personally brought for your entire family tonight." The silence following my declaration hung heavily in the air. Barbara stared at the black folder as if it were a venomous snake slithering onto her pristine silk tablecloth. Her sculpted face twisted into a mask of pure confusion. Preston let out a shaky breath beside me, running his trembling hands through his carefully styled hair. He looked completely lost, unable to comprehend how the quiet, compliant woman he thought he knew had suddenly turned the tables. The sheer audacity of my standing up seemed to paralyze the entire head table. The waiters who had been hovering near the kitchen doors froze in place, holding trays of completely untouched warm dinner food now. The wealthy investors scattered throughout the dining room leaned forward in their chairs. Their business instincts kicked in, recognizing the unmistakable tone of a woman who was not bluffing. But in every toxic family, there is always someone whose arrogance blinds them to shifting reality. In this family, that person was Preston's younger sister, Bianca. The sharp scraping of a wooden chair against the marble floor shattered the quiet. Bianca stood up from her seat. She was 28 years old and draped in a custom silk gown. She possessed the same haughty entitlement as her mother, but lacked the refinement to mask it. Bianca had always viewed me as a peasant she could use to make herself feel superior. Now her face was flushed with indignant rage. She pointed a manicured finger in my direction. "What kind of pathetic joke is this?" Bianca demanded, her voice shrill and echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "You do not have any legal notices, Penelope. You are just throwing a tantrum because my mother finally put you in your place." I kept my hands resting lightly on the folder. Bianca, I said calmly, this does not concern you. You might want to sit down before you embarrass yourself. That was the wrong thing to say to a woman who had never been told no. Bianca let out a dramatic scoff, marching around the head table to stop right behind Preston. The scent of her overpowering designer perfume washed over me. She crossed her arms tightly, looking at my black folder with absolute disgust. You are embarrassing yourself, Bianca sneered, leaning closer. We all know exactly what you are doing. You are acting tough with your little black folder, but it is a pathetic bluff. We know you run some failing startup out of a rented co-working space. You do not have lawyers, you do not have legal notices, you barely have enough money to put gas in that ancient car you drove here tonight. Preston looked up at his sister, offering a weak smile. Bianca, please just let it go, he murmured, trying to de-escalate the situation. She is just upset. I am not letting this go. Preston, Bianca snapped, cutting him off. She needs to hear the truth. She looked back at me, her eyes gleaming with malicious satisfaction, ready to deliver her ultimate takedown. My mother is right about you, Penelope. You bring absolutely nothing to this family. You have always been jealous of us. I tilted my head, keeping my expression perfectly neutral. Jealous of what exactly, I asked. Of our success, Bianca declared proudly, tossing her hair. Of our business acumen. You try to act like some high-powered executive, but you are a joke. Look at me. I own one of the most exclusive high-end fashion boutiques downtown. I built a luxury brand from the ground up because I actually understand how the real world works. You just play on your computer and pretend to be important. I listened to her boast about her boutique, feeling a profound sense of irony settling into my bones. Bianca loved to talk about her business. She paraded it around at family gatherings as proof of her superior intellect. She never mentioned that her father completely funded the launch, or that her mother routinely bought out half the inventory to keep the revenue numbers looking respectable. In her mind, she was a self-made business tycoon. You spent your entire 20s eating ramen noodles and staring at spreadsheets in a tiny apartment, Bianca continued, her voice growing louder for the benefit of the surrounding guests. We spent our summers touring Europe and sailing in the Hamptons. You gave up your youth trying to claw your way out of the middle class, and you still ended up with nothing. You run a failing little startup, and you think you can sit at this table and threaten my family with legal notices. It is hilarious. I looked at Bianca, taking in her arrogant posture and her furious, glaring eyes. She was convinced her reality was the only reality. She thought my 20s were a tragic tale of poverty and struggle. She did not understand that while she was posting vacation photos from Mediterranean yachts, I was quietly building the foundation of a financial empire. I had not been eating ramen because I was broke. I was building a war chest while she was playing dress-up with her father's credit cards. Are you finished, Bianca? I asked, remaining low and steady. I am finished when you pick up your cheap bag and walk out of this country club, she shot back. You are a fraud, Penelope. You always have been. Now open that folder and show us the blank papers inside. Prove to everyone here that you are just a desperate gold digger making empty threats. I unclasped my hands and let my fingers rest on the edge of the black folder. The room grew impossibly quiet once again. The guests who had been whispering a moment ago stopped to watch. Even the waiters stood completely motionless. They were all waiting for me to open the folder and reveal the empty bluff Bianca had so confidently predicted. I think you have a very skewed perception of reality, Bianca, I said smoothly, looking up into her furious eyes. You seem to believe that your family holds all the power simply because your mother can afford to rent this dining hall for the evening. You believe your boutique is a testament to your business skills because you have never had to face a single genuine consequence in your entire life. I pulled the cover of the black folder open. The crisp white documents inside were perfectly organized, each one representing months of careful, meticulous financial strategy. I did not look at the crowd. I kept my focus entirely on the spoiled, arrogant woman standing in front of me. You are right about one thing, Bianca. I continued, sliding my hand over the top document. I did spend my 20s staring at spreadsheets. I spent thousands of hours analyzing market trends, assessing corporate vulnerabilities, and tracking property acquisitions. But I assure you, I was not wasting my time. I was learning exactly how the real world works. I picked up the first document from the stack. It was printed on heavy premium paper, bearing the official seal of my holding company. I held it out, extending my arm, so the document hovered in the air directly between us. Why do you not take a look at this failing little startup of mine? Bianca, I offered, my voice ringing with absolute chilling certainty. I think you will find my highly educational business documents extremely interesting, and they will teach you a painful lesson. Bianca stared at the thick premium paper hovering in the air between us. For a brief second I saw a flicker of genuine hesitation cross her perfectly made-up face. She was used to people backing down when she raised her voice. She expected me to burst into tears and run out of the country club carrying my worn leather tote bag in shame. But seeing me sit there completely unbothered holding a legal document with a corporate seal threw her off balance. However, her fragile ego could not allow her to back down in front of 66 wealthy guests. With a dramatic roll of her eyes, she snatched the paper from my hand. Her diamond bracelets clinked together as she held the document away from her body, pretending to be entirely unimpressed. You really went through a lot of trouble to print out some fake corporate letterhead. Penelope, she scoffed, her voice dripping with venomous sarcasm. Did you use up the last of your printer ink for this? What is it? A strongly worded complaint to the manager. Let me guess, your startup is suing us for emotional damages. I leaned back in my chair, interlacing my fingers and resting them on the table. No, Bianca, I said, my voice smooth and resonant in the quiet dining room. My little startup does not sue people for emotional damages. We do not deal in petty grievances or family drama. My firm specializes in private equity and distressed debt. We acquire over-leveraged assets from people who spend more than they have. We find companies that are bleeding cash, strip away the dead weight, and restructure them for profit. It is a highly lucrative field if you have the stomach for it. Bianca laughed, a harsh, grating sound that bounced off the crystal chandeliers above us. Private equity, she mocked loudly, looking around the room. You expect us to believe you run a private equity firm. You drive a 10-year-old Honda Civic. You buy your clothes at vintage thrift shops. You lived in a tiny apartment before Preston took pity on you. People in private equity summer in the Hamptons, Penelope. They do not eat ramen noodles for dinner. I let her finish her little speech, allowing her arrogance to fill the room. You are confusing wealth with the performance of wealth. Bianca, I explained patiently, like a teacher instructing a particularly slow student. You see, people who want to look rich buy expensive sports cars and designer handbags. They go on lavish European vacations funded by parental credit cards and post the photos online to make sure everyone knows how important they are. But people who are actually building generational wealth do not care about looking rich. I did not spend my 20s eating ramen noodles because I was broke. I did it because every single dollar I earned went directly into building my capital reserves. While you were sailing in the Mediterranean and playing dress-up in your high-end fashion boutique, I was quietly acquiring distressed assets. I was building a financial empire from the ground up while you were busy spending money you never earned. A subtle shift occurred in the dining room. The snickering from the extended family completely stopped. The wealthy investors and business partners sitting at the surrounding tables suddenly sat up straighter. They recognized the language I was using. They understood the difference between a trust fund socialite and a self-made equity manager. They were no longer looking at me like a charity case. They were looking at me like a predator that had successfully infiltrated the flock. Preston shifted nervously beside me, his breathing growing shallow. He reached out to touch my arm, but I gave him a look so cold he immediately pulled his hand back. Bianca, however, was too blinded by her own entitlement to read the changing atmosphere in the room. She scoffed again and finally looked down at the document she had snatched from my hand. I watched her eyes dart back and forth across the page. I could see the exact moment her brain tried to process the complex legal terminology and failed. She was a woman who knew everything about seasonal color palettes and nothing about corporate asset transfers. She frowned, her perfectly shaped eyebrows drawing together in frustration. This is just a bunch of legal gibberish, Bianca declared, waving the paper dismissively. It is a fake deed of assignment. You probably downloaded a template from the internet. You expect me to be intimidated by a piece of paper with the name Obsidian Holdings stamped on it. Who even is Obsidian Holdings? I smiled, letting the name hang in the air for a moment. Several of the businessmen in the room suddenly gasped. Obsidian Holdings was not a secret in the Chicago financial district. It was known as a ruthless, highly efficient private equity firm that had been aggressively buying up distressed commercial real estate over the past 2 years. They just did not know who was pulling the strings behind the anonymous corporate veil. Obsidian Holdings is my failing little startup, Bianca. I said, my voice ringing with quiet authority. I founded it when I was 27 years old. I am the anonymous majority shareholder and the chief executive officer. And that piece of legal gibberish you are holding in your hand is not a fake template downloaded from the internet. It is a certified notice of acquisition. Bianca stared at me, her mouth slightly open. She looked back down at the paper, reading the heavy black text at the top of the page. I could see her lips moving silently as she tried to sound out the name of the commercial real estate holding company listed on the document. It was a holding company that her father Richard had done business with for over a decade. I decided to end her confusion and spell it out for her completely. 3 weeks ago, Obsidian Holdings finalized a hostile takeover of Vanguard Commercial Properties. I explained, my voice carrying effortlessly across the dead silent dining hall. We purchased their entire portfolio of commercial assets after they defaulted on several massive development loans. It was a very clean, highly profitable acquisition for my firm. We acquired 22 prime real estate locations across the downtown luxury district. Bianca blinked, her eyes wide with a sudden creeping panic. Vanguard Commercial Properties, she repeated, her voice trembling slightly. That is the company that manages the retail spaces on Michigan Avenue. The color began to drain from her cheeks as the reality of the situation finally pierced through her thick armor of arrogance. Yes, Bianca. I smiled, leaning forward and resting my forearms on the table. Vanguard Commercial Properties owns the flagship retail building where you operate your precious high-end fashion boutique. They have been your commercial landlord since you opened your doors 3 years ago. But since my firm just bought the entire asset portfolio of Vanguard, that means your boutique now sits on property owned exclusively by me. I am your new commercial landlord. The silence in the room shattered as a collective gasp erupted from the surrounding tables. Preston buried his face in his hands, letting out a pathetic, defeated groan. Bianca took a step backward, clutching the legal notice against her chest, as if it were burning her skin. You cannot do this, she stammered, her confident posture completely crumbling. Bianca's lips parted, but no sound came out. She looked down at the acquisition notice again, searching for a sentence that would somehow reverse what she had just heard. Her eyes moved faster across the page, but panic had already destroyed her ability to pretend she understood the document. You may own the building, she finally said, forcing the words through a tight jaw, but that does not give you the right to interfere with my business. I have a valid lease. My boutique is protected. I reached into the folder and removed a second document. This one was thinner but far more dangerous to her than the acquisition notice. I placed it on the table beside the unsigned prenuptial agreement. You did have a valid lease, Bianca, I replied. What you do not have is a valid payment history. Her face changed instantly. For the first time that evening, she looked toward Richard before looking back at me. It was a tiny, involuntary movement, but it told me everything. Bianca had not merely fallen behind on rent. Her parents knew about it. I opened the notice to the page marked with a black tab. According to the records transferred to Obsidian Holdings with the Vanguard portfolio, your boutique has failed to make a complete rent payment for 8 consecutive months. You made 2 partial transfers during that period, both from an account controlled by your father's logistics company. Neither transfer satisfied the balance. Late fees, property charges, insurance penalties, and unpaid common area expenses have continued to accumulate. That is confidential, Bianca snapped. Her voice was much quieter now. You cannot announce private business records in front of everyone. You announced that you built a luxury brand from the ground up in front of everyone, I reminded her. I am simply providing the missing financial details. Several guests exchanged looks. The investors understood immediately what those 2 transfers meant. Richard had been moving corporate money into his daughter's boutique to keep her fantasy alive. Bianca gripped the acquisition notice so tightly that the paper bent between her fingers. My accountant handles the rent, she insisted. If there was an administrative delay, it will be corrected tomorrow. There was no administrative delay, I said. Your former landlord sent you 12 written demands for payment. You ignored 9 of them. Your attorney requested 3 extensions and promised funds that never arrived. Last month, your store manager warned Vanguard that payroll was being covered with a corporate credit card belonging to your father. 2 weeks ago, the utility company issued a final disconnection notice. Your boutique is not experiencing a temporary setback. It is insolvent. The word struck her harder than any insult could have. My boutique is profitable, she shouted. We have celebrity clients, we have waiting lists, we have exclusive European inventory. You have unsold inventory purchased on credit, I corrected. Your so-called waiting list is a spreadsheet containing customers who attended one promotional event 18 months ago. Your monthly sales do not cover half of your operating expenses. Your mother has been purchasing merchandise through 3 separate personal accounts, so the store reports would appear healthier than they are. And even with that artificial revenue, you have not paid your landlord in 8 months. Barbara shot to her feet. How dare you investigate my daughter, she screamed. Those purchases were gifts. There is nothing illegal about a mother supporting her child. Supporting her would have meant teaching her how to run a business, I replied. What you did was manufacture sales figures so she could continue telling people she was self-made. A few guests who had laughed at me earlier now lowered their eyes. Bianca's boutique had been one of Barbara's favorite subjects at every charity luncheon. She had described it as a brilliant independent success. Now everyone knew it was a stage set, held upright by unpaid bills and money diverted from Richard's company. Bianca unfolded the second document with shaking hands. What is this? She whispered. Read the heading aloud, I said. She stared at me. You wanted the whole room to see what was inside my folder. Now let them hear it. Her throat moved as she swallowed. Formal notice of default termination of commercial tenancy and immediate preservation of tenant assets, she read. Her voice cracked on the final words. The room became perfectly still. Keep going, I said. Bianca looked toward Preston for help, but he would not meet her eyes. She looked toward Barbara, who seemed too stunned to speak. Finally, she turned to Richard. Dad, she whispered. Fix this. Richard stepped forward, but I held up one finger. Finish reading. Bianca's eyes filled with tears as she continued. Due to 8 months of unpaid rent and repeated material breaches of the lease, the landlord is exercising its right to terminate occupancy. Access to the premises will be suspended at 9 tomorrow morning. All inventory fixtures, computer systems, and business records located inside the unit will remain secured pending a court-supervised accounting and settlement of the outstanding balance. Her voice faded. The paper slipped lower in her hands. That means you cannot remove the dresses tonight, I explained. You cannot transfer the inventory to another location. You cannot empty the registers, delete the sales records, or strip the fixtures from the walls. My property team has already documented every item in the boutique. A neutral security company will take control of the premises in the morning. You are stealing my business, Bianca screamed. No, I am preventing a defaulting tenant from stealing assets that may be required to satisfy lawful debts. She turned toward Richard again, this time with open desperation. Dad, you promised Vanguard would never evict me. You said you knew the owner. You said you would send the rent before the wedding. Every face near the head table turned toward him. Richard's expression hardened. Bianca, be quiet. But she was too frightened to obey. You said the company would cover it, she cried. You told me the investors would never notice one more transfer. A wave of shocked murmurs rolled through the dining hall. Richard moved toward his daughter with fury in his eyes. Stop talking right now. I watched the investors begin to study him differently. Bianca had just confirmed that money from his logistics company had been used to support her failing boutique. The family humiliation was no longer merely social. It had become evidence. Richard pointed at me. This ends now, he thundered. You came into a private family celebration with stolen records and forged notices. I will have you removed from this club and prosecuted. Security. His command echoed across the room, but no one approached me. 2 uniformed guards near the main doors looked toward the country club manager, then remained exactly where they were. Richard shouted again, Did you hear me? Remove this woman immediately. I closed the folder and looked calmly toward the guards. Neither man moved. Richard's face darkened. What is going on? The security company assigned to this event is a subsidiary contractor retained by Vanguard Commercial Properties, I said. When Obsidian acquired Vanguard's portfolio, its active security contracts transferred with the properties. The regional director reports to my asset management team. I let that fact settle before giving him a small smile. So I would not call security just yet, Richard. Tonight they work for me too. One of the guards gave me a subtle, respectful nod. Bianca stared from the guards to the eviction notice. Her knees appeared to weaken. The designer boutique she had used as proof of her superiority was no longer hers to enter. Her inventory was frozen, her records were preserved, and her careless confession had turned the attention of her father's investors toward Richard. Preston finally pushed his chair backward. The polished calm he had maintained all evening disappeared from his face. His sister's collapse had frightened him, but the mention of corporate transfers frightened him even more. He reached toward me as if he could still force the story to stop before it reached him. That was when the golden boy decided he could no longer remain silent. Preston rose so abruptly that his chair struck the floor behind him. The crash silenced the nearest tables. His face had turned dark red, and the hand holding his whiskey glass was trembling hard enough to send liquid over the rim. That is enough, Penelope, he said. His voice was no longer the quiet, pleading whisper he had used when his mother first produced the prenuptial agreement. The polished fiancé had disappeared. In his place stood a frightened man watching the family illusion that protected him collapse in public. I remained beside my chair. Enough of what, Preston? The truth about your sister's boutique, or the truth about where your father has been sending company money? He slammed the glass onto the table. You have no right to come here and attack my family. Your family invited 66 people to watch them attack me, I replied. I am simply refusing to cooperate. He moved around the table toward me. At first his hands were open as if he intended to guide me gently away, but his expression told a different story. When he reached me, his right hand shot toward my upper arm. I stepped back before his fingers could close around me. Do not touch me, I said. A few people at the front tables gasped. Preston froze with his arm extended, suddenly aware that every investor, relative, waiter, and country club employee had seen him attempt to grab me. He lowered his hand and forced a laugh. Everyone needs to calm down, he announced. Penelope is overwhelmed. She has been under enormous pressure because of the wedding. I watched him rebuild his public mask, one careful sentence at a time. This is not her, he continued, turning toward the guests instead of looking at me. She has been struggling emotionally for months. I did not want to discuss it because I was trying to protect her privacy, but tonight she is clearly having some kind of episode. The cruelty of the tactic was breathtaking. When intimidation failed, he turned to discrediting my sanity. If he could not remove the evidence, he would convince the room that the woman presenting it was unstable. Barbara seized the opportunity immediately. I knew there was something wrong with her, she said loudly. No normal woman behaves like this at her own rehearsal dinner. Preston nodded with false sadness. She has periods when she becomes fixated on numbers and convinced that people are plotting against her. The wedding stress must have triggered another manic episode, another, I repeated. He glanced at me, and for 1 second panic flashed across his face. He had invented a history without realizing that a fabricated history could be questioned. Yes, another, he said. I have been dealing with this privately for a long time. Have you? Penelope, please, he said, lowering his voice, as if he were speaking to a dangerous patient. Put the documents away. Come with me to the lobby. We will call your doctor and get you the help you need. Which doctor? His jaw tightened. The room waited. What is my doctor's name, Preston? Since you have supposedly been managing my serious mental health condition for months, tell everyone who has been treating me. He looked toward Barbara. She looked back at him helplessly. This is not the time for an interrogation, he snapped. It became the time when you diagnosed me in front of 66 witnesses. A distinguished woman near the front table leaned toward her husband. Even from several feet away, I could hear her whisper that Preston's story did not make sense. I took one step toward him. Tell them the name of the clinic. Tell them the medication I take. Tell them the date of the last episode you claim to remember. His face glistened beneath the chandelier light. I do not have to prove private medical information to anyone, he said. You cannot prove information that does not exist. The first open signs of doubt moved through the room. Barbara's friends stopped nodding. Richard's investors watched Preston with the same sharp attention they had given my corporate documents. Preston changed tactics again. I have done nothing but take care of this woman, he declared. I rescued her from a tiny apartment. I gave her a place to live. I paid the household expenses. I introduced her to people she never could have met on her own. This is the gratitude I receive. He pointed toward my vintage dress as if it were evidence. Look at her. Does anyone honestly believe a woman who dresses like that owns a private equity firm? She is angry because my family finally asked her to sign a reasonable agreement. Now she is manufacturing documents to punish us. Bianca, still holding the eviction notice, did not support him. She was too busy staring at the words immediate preservation of tenant assets. I picked up my water glass and took a slow drink. Preston's performance depended on urgency. My calmness made him look increasingly frantic. You claim you have taken care of me, I said. Let us examine that claim. There is nothing to examine. Then answer one simple question. Why have I been managing your checking account every Sunday night for the past year? His mouth closed. I continued before he could invent another lie. Why did you give me access to every personal account you owned? Why did you send me spreadsheets listing your monthly obligations? Why did you ask me to speak to lenders on your behalf? Why did you insist that no letters involving your finances be sent to your parents' address? Barbara slowly turned toward her son. What lenders? She asked. Preston ignored her. Penelope handles household budgeting, he said quickly. That is all. Couples help each other. Household budgeting does not require negotiating with collection agencies. The room changed again. A man seated 2 tables away lowered his phone and stared directly at Preston. Several of Richard's business associates knew the language of financial distress. They recognized that I was not describing a shared grocery account. Preston moved closer, dropping his voice. Stop talking. Why? Because you are embarrassing yourself. No, Preston. You are afraid I am about to stop protecting you. He reached toward my folder. I placed my hand firmly on top of it. Give me those papers, he demanded. They belong to me. Everything in our home belongs to me, he shouted. The loft is mine. The accounts are mine. The life you have been enjoying is mine. You are a guest who forgot how fortunate she was. His voice echoed across the dining hall. In trying to reassert control, he had revealed the entitlement underneath every promise he had made during our relationship. I looked at him and finally understood why he had allowed Barbara to ambush me. He did not merely fear his family. He agreed with them. He believed my value came from his permission to remain near him. You told me to sign the prenup because you thought I had nowhere else to go, I said. He folded his arms. You do not. The answer was so immediate that several guests visibly recoiled. I opened my black folder again. There were no blank pages inside. The next group of documents included bank statements, debt settlement letters, loan records, and employment notices. I removed the first page and held it where Preston could see the letterhead. His arrogance vanished. Do not, he whispered. I thought you wanted transparency, I said. After all, family legacy is on the line. He looked toward the doors. For a moment I thought he might run, but running would have confirmed everything. His pride kept him trapped at the head table. Preston's hand dropped to his side. The room remained silent as I turned toward Richard and Barbara. Your son has spent the last year pretending to be someone he is not, I announced. And unlike his accusation about my mental health, I brought evidence. I placed a termination letter on the table. Preston recognized it immediately. He had once kept it folded inside a cookbook because he believed no one in his family would ever look there. 14 months ago, Preston was dismissed from his technology firm, I said. Not laid off, not transferred. Dismissed for chronic absenteeism, falsified performance reports, and repeated failure to complete assigned projects. Richard's face tightened. That is impossible. Preston told us he was promoted into a confidential strategy division. I turned the termination notice so he could read the date and company letterhead. There was no strategy division, there was no promotion. He stopped going to work and the company finally stopped paying him. Preston lunged for the page. I pulled it back before he could reach it. That document is stolen, he said. You had no right to search through my personal files. You gave it to me after the first collection agency threatened legal action. You asked me to keep it because you were terrified your parents would discover that their golden boy had failed. Barbara looked at him. Preston tell me she is lying. He could not. I removed a brokerage statement and placed it beside the termination notice. After he lost his salary, he decided regular employment was beneath him. He used his remaining severance payment to become a full-time day trader. He told me he had developed a proprietary strategy that could replace his old income within 3 months. A few investors gave short, humorless laughs. They had heard that kind of confidence before. During the first 6 weeks, he lost nearly half of the account. Instead of stopping, he increased the risk. He purchased volatile positions with borrowed money, convinced that one successful trade would recover every previous loss. I set down another statement. By the 4th month, the severance package was gone. Preston shook his head. Markets fluctuate. Those were temporary losses. Temporary losses do not generate permanent collection notices, I replied. The next pages documented a trail of personal loans. Preston had borrowed from online lenders, opened credit lines, using inflated income information, and moved balances from one card to another to keep the defaults hidden. He had even listed his former employer as his current source of income months after being dismissed. Richard picked up one statement. His eyes moved rapidly across the figures. $214,000, he said. That was the balance before penalties and settlement costs. Barbara gripped the edge of the table. You had that much debt and never told us. Preston looked at her with sudden anger. What was I supposed to say? Dad spent my entire life telling everyone I was the successor to his empire. You would have treated me like a failure. You are a failure, Bianca muttered through her tears. He turned on her. Your store has not paid rent in 8 months. The siblings stared at each other, each furious that the other's collapse had exposed the family myth. I continued. When the lenders began calling, Preston changed his phone number. When letters arrived, he hid them. When one creditor threatened to contact Richard's office, he finally came to me. I remembered that night clearly. Preston had arrived at the loft after midnight, pale and shaking. He told me he had made a few bad investments and needed temporary help. He swore the total was less than $30,000. The next morning, I discovered 6 separate lenders and a balance more than 7 times what he had admitted. He begged me not to tell anyone. I looked directly at him. You said your father would disown you. You said your mother would never recover from the humiliation. You told me you wanted to fix the problem quietly and rebuild your life. For one brief moment, something like shame appeared in his expression. I negotiated with every lender I told the room. I challenged unlawful penalties, arranged settlement terms, and paid the valid balances from my personal income. I spent weeks cleaning up a disaster I did not create, because I believed the man I loved was frightened and deserved one chance to start again. Richard held the settlement statement with both hands. She paid all of this, he asked. Preston stared at the floor. Answer your father, I said. His voice was barely audible. Yes. The confession traveled across the room like a shockwave. I paid more than $200,000 to prevent Preston's financial collapse. I also covered the household expenses he claimed to pay. The utility bills came from the small account he maintained for appearances, but every major cost was funded by companies I controlled. Insurance, property taxes, repairs, building assessments, and the debt settlements all came from me. Preston lifted his head. You offered to help. I did. Helping you was not the mistake. Believing you would become honest afterward was the mistake. I produced the final sheet, a summary he had signed, acknowledging the settlements and promising to disclose any future borrowing. The signature at the bottom was unmistakably his. 3 weeks after signing this, he opened another brokerage account without telling me, I said. He deposited money I had transferred for wedding expenses and lost most of it in 12 days. Barbara sat down hard. Preston, she whispered. He tried to recover his confidence. I was going to replace it before the wedding. None of this changes what Penelope did tonight. She planned this humiliation. No, I said. You planned mine. You knew exactly where my money came from. You knew I had built Obsidian Holdings. You knew I had paid your debts. Yet you sat beside me while your mother called me a gold digger and demanded 80% of my future income. The guests no longer looked at me with pity. Their attention had shifted completely to Preston. You did not stay silent because you were afraid of your mother, I continued. You stayed silent because the prenup benefited you. It would have converted the woman who rescued you into a permanent source of income. You wanted me legally obligated to finance your failures while your family continued pretending you were successful. Preston's face twisted. That is not true. Then explain why the agreement was prepared without my attorney. Explain why it was presented hours before the wedding. Explain why it defines my income as compensation owed to you. He had no answer. I gathered the debt records into one neat stack and tapped the signed acknowledgement on top. This is what I brought to your family, I said. I brought the money that kept your son away from court. I brought the discipline that kept his creditors from reaching your office. I brought the silence that protected the reputation all of you value more than character. Then I looked at Preston. And tonight you repaid that loyalty by helping your mother build a legal trap for me. He stood motionless, surrounded by proof of every lie he had told. The confident technology executive no longer existed. In front of 66 witnesses, he had become exactly what he feared most, an unemployed gambler whose life had been financed by the woman his family called worthless. Richard stared at his son, his face a rigid mask of horror. The golden boy was nothing more than an unemployed gambler surviving on the charity of the woman they had spent the evening mocking. Barbara had completely lost her ability to speak. Her mouth hung open as she looked back and forth between Preston and me. Preston could not give her comfort. His secret was out. The carefully curated lie he had maintained for over a year was lying in pieces on the silk tablecloth for everyone to see. A man with a fragile ego can only be pushed so far into the light before he tries to drag someone else back into the dark with him. You manipulative witch! Preston spat, his voice shaking with sudden desperate anger. He slammed both his hands flat onto the table. You think you are so smart. You think you can just come in here and humiliate me in front of my family and my friends. I am not humiliating you, Preston, I said. I am just reading the unedited version of your resume aloud. You are the one who decided to bring a 40-page prenuptial agreement to dinner to protect assets you do not even possess. I possess plenty! He shouted, his voice cracking slightly as he scrambled frantically to find any remaining shred of leverage. I still provide for you. I am the one putting a roof over your head. You would be living on the street if it were not for me. I raised an eyebrow, letting his desperate words hang in the heavy air. They were captivated by his rapid descent into madness. Do you really want to go down this road, Preston? I asked softly. I would highly recommend you sit down and drink some water before you embarrass yourself any further tonight. I am not sitting down until you get out, he'd, pointing a shaking finger toward the heavy oak exit doors at the back of the room. You think paying off some temporary debts makes you superior. You are still living in my house. That is my $1.5 million luxury loft. My name is on the mailbox. I pay the monthly utility bills. I am the reason you get to wake up to a stunning view of the city skyline every single morning. He puffed out his chest, trying to reclaim his alpha status in front of the watching investors. He desperately needed them to believe he still held the ultimate power in our relationship. When this dinner is over, you are going back to my loft, and you are packing your cheap vintage bags, Preston ordered, his tone dripping with newly manufactured venom. You are going to take your thrift store clothes and your worn-out tote bag, and you are going to get out of my property. I want you gone by midnight. You can go sleep in your 10-year-old Honda Civic for all I care. You are absolutely done living off my charity. A few of Barbara's friends nodded subtly, clearly relieved that Preston was finally putting his foot down and reclaiming his property. They clung to the familiar narrative of the wealthy man evicting the ungrateful squatter. It was a story they understood. It was a story that made them feel safe in their own privilege. I looked at Preston, taking in his flushed face and his desperate posturing. He really believed his own lies. He had lived in that gorgeous three-bedroom loft for so long, telling everyone at the country club that it was his ultimate bachelor pad, that he had actually convinced himself he owned it. He had somehow convinced his parents he bought it with his massive tech bonuses. Preston, I said, my voice laced with a heavy dose of pity. You do not own that loft. You never have. His face contorted into a nasty sneer. What are you talking about? I have the keys. The doorman calls me Mr. Preston. It is my home. I reached into my black legal folder once again. My fingers brushed past the acquisition notices for Bianca's boutique and found the second heavy document I had prepared for this exact moment. I pulled it out and placed it on the table right next to the puddle of spilled whiskey. I suggest you take a very close look at this document before you start dictating eviction timelines, I said, tapping the center of the crisp white page with my index finger. This is the official registered deed to that $1.5 million luxury loft. Preston scoffed loudly, but his eyes darted down to the paper. He could not help himself. He snatched the deed off the table, holding it up to the light of the chandelier overhead. I watched his eyes scan the dense legal text at the top of the page. He was looking for his name. He was looking for the validation he so desperately craved to prove to the room that he was still a man of immense wealth and property. But his name was not on the deed. His eyes widened, and a deep, confused frown creased his forehead. He read the middle section of the page again, his lips moving slightly as he processed the words. What is this? He muttered, his voice losing all its aggressive volume. This says the property belongs to a corporate entity. It says the loft is owned by Skyline Properties LLC. He looked up at me completely bewildered. His brain was struggling to connect the dots. You do not own it either, he said, a triumphant smirk starting to form on his face once again. You are just a tenant too. We both rent from Skyline Properties. You are completely delusional, Penelope. You brought a commercial lease agreement to a rehearsal dinner and tried to pass it off as ownership. I let out a soft, genuine laugh. It was the kind of laugh that comes from deep within the chest when a joke lands perfectly. Preston, I said, shaking my head slowly from side to side. You really have absolutely no idea who you have been sleeping next to for the last 3 years, do you? I folded my hands together and rested them gently on the table, leaning slightly toward him so he could hear every single syllable clearly. I do not rent from Skyline Properties LLC, Preston. I am the sole registered owner and managing director of Skyline Properties LLC. I formed that corporation 5 years ago to manage my personal real estate investments. The triumphant smirk on Preston's face vanished instantly. The color drained from his cheeks, leaving him looking like a ghost in a suit. I bought that loft in cash 3 years ago, I explained, my voice steady and unyielding. I bought it right before we moved in together. I let you put your name on the mailbox because you begged me to. You said you needed to project a successful image to your family and your business partners. I let you pay the utility bills so you could feel like you were contributing to the household in some small way. But you do not own a single square inch of that property. You are my tenant. And unfortunately for you, you are a tenant who violated the strict terms of our cohabitation agreement by publicly attempting to coerce me into signing a fraudulent legal contract. However, I am going to be far more gracious to you tonight than you have been to me. I will give you a full 24 hours to pack your bags and vacate my property before I have the local police physically remove you for trespassing on my private estate. Preston remained frozen with the deed in his hands. The paper shook as he looked from the name, Skyline Properties LLC, to my face. 24 hours earlier, he had believed the loft was proof of his success. Now he understood that even the roof over his head had been provided by the woman he allowed his family to degrade. He turned toward Richard with the helpless expression of a child expecting his father to repair the consequences. Dad, he said. Do something. Richard did not answer him. His attention had shifted to the black folder on the table. More specifically, he was staring at the thick third set of documents still inside it. His breathing had become shallow. The anger remained on his face, but it no longer looked powerful. It looked defensive. Barbara noticed the change. Richard, she demanded, tell her she cannot evict Preston. Call your attorneys. Call the police. Put this trash back in her place. He raised one hand without looking at her. The gesture silenced her. Where did you get those files? He asked me. The question was quiet, but the investors nearest the head table heard it. Several of them leaned forward. What files? I asked. Do not play games with me. The records involving my company, the lender schedules, the internal projections. Those materials are confidential. I closed the folder halfway. You seem remarkably certain about documents I have not shown anyone yet. His face tightened. Richard stepped around Bianca, who was still clutching her eviction notice, and approached me. He tried to recover the posture that had intimidated employees and junior business partners for decades. He straightened his shoulders, adjusted his cufflinks, and lowered his voice. Whatever you think you found, you do not understand the structure of my company. Logistics is complicated. We carry temporary leverage during expansion cycles. That does not give a small investment firm permission to threaten my family. Small investment firm, I repeated. He glanced at the guests as if he regretted the phrase. Obsidian Holdings had a reputation among the people seated around him, and he knew it. You accessed protected corporate information through your relationship with my son, he continued. That is theft. If you distribute one page, my legal team will bury you in litigation. I looked toward Preston. He was still holding the loft deed, but he would not meet his father's eyes. I did not obtain anything through Preston, I said. Your son could not explain the difference between operating revenue and borrowed cash if his life depended on it. A few investors laughed despite the tension. Richard's nostrils flared. Then how? The same way any creditor performs due diligence, public filings, loan documents, UCC records, default notices, audited statements supplied by the lenders. Your company left a trail so wide that no one had to steal anything. That is a lie. Is it? I removed a summary sheet from the folder but kept it in my hand. Adams Continental Logistics has not produced a sustainable operating profit in 5 years. Revenue increased on paper because you acquired routes and warehouses with borrowed money. But the acquired divisions never generated enough cash to service the loans used to purchase them. Richard's jaw hardened. Expansion requires capital. Profitable expansion creates cash flow. Yours created refinancing emergencies. The room became still. I continued. Each time a payment deadline approached, you opened a new line of credit, shifted funds between subsidiaries, and reported the borrowed cash as evidence of stability. You delayed vendor payments to make quarterly balances look stronger. You sold receivables at steep discounts. You borrowed against equipment that was already losing value. One of the investors near the front stood. Richard, is any of this true? Richard turned sharply. Sit down, Arthur. This woman is simplifying technical transactions. She does not understand. Arthur did not sit. I looked at him. Last quarter, the company reported a cash reserve of $18 million. More than $12 million came from a bridge loan that closed 4 days before the reporting date. The funds remained in the account long enough to appear on the statement, then were immediately transferred to cover overdue obligations. Arthur's expression changed. Richard pointed at me. Stop. I placed the summary on the table. You used debt to disguise debt, I said, and while the company was collapsing, you continued financing the performance of wealth. I gestured around the dining hall. This rehearsal dinner cost $60,000. The deposit was paid from a corporate hospitality account belonging to a struggling logistics subsidiary. Barbara's jewelry insurance was paid through an executive benefit account. Bianca's boutique received transfers disguised as marketing expenses. Preston's country club dues were categorized as client development. Barbara stared at her husband. You told me those accounts were part of our family trust. Richard ignored her. I was not finished. The family estate was refinanced twice in 3 years. The second refinancing did not fund repairs or investment. It covered corporate interest payments. Your luxury vehicles are leased through shell subsidiaries. Your offshore reserves were pledged as collateral. Even the charitable foundation bearing your family name has been used to move cash between accounts. A wave of alarm moved through the investors. Richard stepped close enough that I could smell the whiskey on his breath. You have no idea who you are threatening, he said. I built one of the largest private logistics networks in the Midwest. I employ thousands of people. I have relationships with banks, judges, and elected officials. A woman with a folder cannot take that away. I did not move. A real empire does not need its owner to list the people he can call for protection, I said. Only a house of cards does. His face went red. Barbara moved beside him. Richard, make her leave. He still did not look at her. His eyes remained fixed on the documents. The investors began asking questions from their tables. Why had distributions been delayed? Why were warehouse assets pledged to multiple facilities? Why had the annual audit not been circulated? Richard answered none of them. Instead, he focused on me. What do you want? He asked. The sudden change in his tone was small but unmistakable. The intimidation had failed. He was negotiating. I want nothing from you personally, I said. This is not revenge disguised as business. Your company made promises it could not keep. My firm now intends to enforce them. Now intends, he repeated. The fear in his eyes sharpened. He finally understood that I was not merely exposing his weakness. I had already positioned myself to control what happened next. Section 4.2. Unveiling the Toxic Debt. I lifted the next document from the folder. It was a transaction summary bearing the names of Richard's 3 largest institutional lenders. 2 weeks ago, Obsidian Holdings approached every major creditor holding secured debt against Adams Continental Logistics, I said. We did not approach them blindly. We had spent months reviewing your payment history, collateral structure, vendor exposure, and failed refinancing attempts. Richard's face lost another shade of color. You were watching me, he said. We were evaluating an opportunity. One of the investors asked the question Richard was too frightened to ask. What kind of opportunity? Distressed debt, I replied. When a borrower becomes too risky, lenders sometimes sell the loan rather than wait through a long bankruptcy. The buyer acquires the creditor's rights, including the right to enforce collateral if the borrower defaults. I looked back at Richard. Your lenders had stopped believing your projections. They knew the company could not satisfy the next payment cycle. They also knew that a public collapse would expose how weakly some of the loans had been supervised. They wanted out before the damage reached their own balance sheets. Richard shook his head. Those banks have worked with me for 20 years. They would never sell my loans without giving me notice. They gave you notice. You ignored it. I placed 3 letters on the table. Each one documented a missed covenant, a failed liquidity requirement, or an overdue payment. Richard had received every letter. His signature appeared on 2 delivery acknowledgments. You requested emergency mediation last month, I continued. During that process, you promised to inject new capital, sell 2 warehouse properties, and suspend all non-essential family spending. You did none of those things. Barbara looked around at the orchids, champagne, and designer decorations that filled the room. Richard spoke through clenched teeth. We were waiting for a major transportation contract to close. Once it closed, the liquidity issue would have disappeared. The contract was rejected 11 days ago. Several investors reacted at once. Richard turned toward them. It has not been formally rejected. Negotiations are ongoing. The client's board issued a written decision. Your company failed the solvency review. His shoulders dropped for a fraction of a second before he forced them upright again. I continued. After that rejection, your largest lender classified the account as impaired. The second lender moved your loans to its special assets division. The third prepared to seek emergency control of the pledged collateral. Arthur stepped closer to the head table. You told us the contract was guaranteed. Richard snapped at him. I said we were the preferred bidder. You said guaranteed, Arthur replied. The investors began talking over one another. Their questions filled the dining hall, but I raised the transaction summary, and the noise gradually faded. Obsidian offered the lenders immediate cash in exchange for the entire debt portfolio, I said. They accepted a substantial discount because certainty was worth more to them than years of litigation against a collapsing borrower. Richard tried to laugh, but the sound came out weak. Even if that were true, buying a few discounted notes does not make you the owner of my company. Not yet, I said. The words silenced him. Debt is leverage, Richard. The amount my firm paid the lenders is irrelevant to the amount you legally owe. We purchased the obligations, the guarantees, the liens, and every enforcement right attached to them. The principal balance did not disappear because the lenders sold it. I slid the transaction summary toward him. As of the closing date, Obsidian Holdings became the sole controlling creditor across your senior secured facilities. He stared at the page but did not touch it. No, he whispered. Yes. He looked toward Preston as though his son might somehow deny the document into non-existence. Preston had nothing to offer. He was standing beside the deed to a home he did not own. Richard looked back at me. We can restructure. You already attempted 3 restructurings. I can bring in new investors. The investors in this room just learned you misrepresented their exposure. I can sell assets. Most of the valuable assets are pledged, and several have already been used as collateral more than once. That accusation caused a sharp reaction from the crowd. A woman seated near Arthur stood up. Richard, did you double pledge company property? Richard ignored her. His eyes remained on me. How much do you want? He asked. The room went quiet again. There it was. The patriarch who had called me a nobody was now asking for a price. This is not a dinner negotiation, I said. There is no number you can whisper to me tonight that restores 5 years of insolvency. Everyone has a number, he replied. Name yours. I already did. Full payment under the loan agreements. He gave a bitter laugh. You know the company cannot pay that. Then you understand the meaning of default. Barbara grabbed his sleeve. Richard, what is she saying? He pulled away from her. For the first time all evening, he looked genuinely old. I opened the formal notice and read the figures aloud. The accelerated principal, accrued interest, penalties, legal costs, and secured obligations exceeded the liquid resources available to the company. Payment was due immediately because multiple covenant violations had triggered acceleration clauses across the portfolio. Richard interrupted. Acceleration can be challenged. You waived most procedural delays when you signed the emergency amendments last year. You needed cash quickly, so you accepted lender protections you apparently never intended to honor. His hands began to shake. I had reviewed those amendments line by line. Richard had personally guaranteed several obligations and pledged both corporate and personal assets. He had signed quickly because he believed another round of borrowing would preserve the illusion until conditions improved. Instead, the signatures had given my firm a direct route into every part of his empire. Arthur moved closer. Are our investments subordinate to this debt? Richard looked away. I answered. Most of the private investment positions are structurally behind the secured lenders. That means the creditor claims are addressed before equity investors recover anything. Anger spread across the room. Richard raised both hands. Everyone calm down. Nothing has been seized. We still have time. I removed a letter bearing that evening's date. No, Richard. The cure period expired at 7 o'clock. His eyes locked onto the timestamp. At precisely 7. My legal team delivered the final enforcement notice to your registered office, your corporate counsel, and every bank holding a controlled account. The notice confirms that the debt is accelerated and payable in full. He reached for the paper, then stopped. You planned this for tonight, he said. I planned for the deadline. Your family selected the evening when it decided to turn a rehearsal dinner into a public trial of my worth. Barbara began shaking her head. This cannot be happening. Richard's voice dropped to a whisper. Give me 48 hours. You had 5 years. 24. You had 12 formal warnings. Until morning. Your lenders already gave you every extension they were willing to give. He stared at me with naked desperation. I will remove Preston from the company. I will close Bianca's boutique. I will sell the estate. Whatever personal insult happened tonight can be corrected. This is not about an insult, I said. It is about enforceable debt and a company you hollowed out to finance your family's vanity. I placed the final page directly in front of him. Richard looked down at the bold heading, but still refused to pick it up. You demanded to know what I brought to this family, I said. I brought the legal authority your creditors transferred to me. I brought every unpaid obligation you tried to hide. And I brought the deadline you believed would never arrive. I straightened and let my voice carry to all 66 guests. You are in default, Richard. Obsidian Holdings is calling the entire debt due effective immediately. Then I placed the third document flat on the table between us. It was the formal notice that would begin the hostile seizure of everything he had pledged. Richard looked down at the third document lying on the marble table. The heavy watermarked paper seemed to mock him. His trembling fingers reached out but hesitated just an inch above the surface as if the paper itself was radioactive. I watched his eyes dart across the bold printed header. It was a formal legal notice of a hostile asset seizure. He blinked rapidly, trying to force his brain to process the complex legal terminology. But the reality was incredibly simple and utterly devastating. By purchasing his toxic corporate debt, my private equity firm had acquired the ultimate leverage over his entire life. He swallowed hard, a thick lump forming in his throat. "You cannot do this," Richard whispered, his voice devoid of all its former booming authority. "You cannot just take my company away from me. I built that logistics empire from the ground up. It is my life work." I leaned forward, resting my palms flat on the table. "You did not build anything sustainable," Richard said calmly. "Yao built a grand illusion funded entirely by outside investment money. And when the illusion started to crack, you borrowed even more to patch the holes. The third document you are looking at is the inevitable consequence of your profound financial arrogance. As your primary creditor, I am legally executing a hostile asset seizure. My firm is taking complete control of your logistics company effective immediately. We are seizing the physical warehouses, the fleet of delivery trucks, and the remaining inventory. You are no longer the chief executive officer. You are just a man with a massive mountain of defaulted debt." A heavy, suffocating silence draped over the dining hall. The only sound was the clinking of ice melting in unattended water glasses. Richard struggled to draw enough air into his lungs as his chest heaved. "But the company is not enough to cover the debt," he stammered, his eyes wide with new terrifying realization. "The corporate assets are heavily depreciated. They will not satisfy the outstanding loan balance." He was right. He knew exactly how precarious his financial situation truly was. I smiled, a cold, empty smile that offered no comfort whatsoever. "You are absolutely correct, Richard," I agreed. "The corporate assets alone are severely insufficient to satisfy your massive default. That is exactly why we investigated the specific terms of the emergency loans you took out last year. You were so desperate for cash to maintain your wealthy facade that you offered personal collateral to secure those corporate loans. Did you really think your creditors would not secure their investments? You signed the guarantee blindly, just to keep the country club memberships active and the champagne flowing." Richard let out a low, agonizing groan and covered his face with his shaking hands. I picked up the third document and read the bold text aloud, for the benefit of the room. "Under the terms of the default execution, my firm is hereby seizing the frozen corporate bank accounts, the remaining offshore cash reserves, and the primary personal collateral listed on the loan agreements." I paused, letting the weight of my words settle over him. "That includes this family estate, Richard. You put your own ancestral home up as collateral for a failing business." The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking pale and sickly in the warm light of the chandeliers. "You do not just lose your business tonight, Richard." I continued, my voice echoing clearly across the vast room. "You lose your bank accounts, your luxury vehicles, and the very roof over your head. You gambled your entire family legacy on a failing logistics company, and you lost everything." The shockwave of my statement hit the head table like a physical force. Preston looked sick to his stomach, his golden boy persona entirely shattered. He finally understood that there was no safety net left for him to fall back on. The endless well of wealth from his father had just dried up completely. He was a bankrupt tenant, without a wealthy father to bail him out. But it was Barbara who finally broke the stunned silence. She leaped out of her chair, knocking over a crystal wine glass. The red liquid spilled across the white silk tablecloth like a spreading stain of blood. "This is a complete lie!" Barbara screamed, her voice shrill and desperate. She pointed a manicured finger at me, her diamond rings flashing aggressively. "You are a manipulative little liar. You do not own our home. We are the most respected family in this entire city. We have generational wealth. You are just a jealous nobody trying to tear us down with fake legal papers." She was unhinged, completely untethered from reality. She refused to accept that her perfectly curated life of luxury was crashing down around her. She desperately needed to maintain the illusion. Barbara turned away from me and frantically faced the 66 guests seated at the tables. She raised her hands in a desperate plea for validation. "Do not listen to a single word this crazy woman is saying," Barbara begged the crowd, her voice cracking with mounting hysteria. "The business of Richard is incredibly profitable. Our company is fine. We are fine. She is just a bitter ex-fiancé throwing a pathetic tantrum because Preston finally realized she was not good enough for our family. Look at these documents. They are obviously forged." Richard, tell them. "Tell your investors that our company is strong." But Richard could not speak. He remained frozen in his chair, staring blankly at the hostile asset seizure notice. He looked like a hollow shell of a man. The desperate pleas from Barbara echoed through the silent dining room, but they were falling on deaf ears. The 66 guests were no longer looking at her with the admiration she craved. Many of these guests were primary business partners and private investors of Richard. They had trusted him with their money. They were funding his lavish lifestyle. And these wealthy investors were not entirely stupid. They could see the absolute terror written clearly across the pale, sweating face of Richard. They recognized the truth in my detailed financial breakdown. A low, anxious murmur began to ripple through the room like a rising tide. The wealthy investors seated at the prime tables were not whispering about my alleged mental health breakdown anymore. They were whispering about their own financial exposure. One by one, the powerful men and women in the room began reaching into their tailored suit jackets and expensive designer evening bags. They pulled out their smartphones, their faces tight with sudden intense panic. The elegant dining hall was quickly illuminated by the cold blue glow of dozens of digital screens. They were frantically logging into their private investment portfolios and checking their corporate banking apps. I watched as the horrifying reality of the situation washed over the crowd. The quiet murmurs quickly escalated into loud, panicked conversations. A distinguished man in a gray suit stood up from his table, his face turning bright red. "My accounts are locked," he shouted, his voice cutting through the rising chaos. "My entire investment fund is tied up in your logistics company, Richard. What did you do with our money?" Another investor stood up, waving her phone angrily. "The corporate accounts are completely frozen," she yelled. The realization hit them all simultaneously as they stared at their screens. They were permanently tied to a bankrupt empire. Total pandemonium broke out the moment the reality of my words truly settled over the elegant dining room. For a brief second there had been that collective holding of breath, where the sheer magnitude of the financial devastation was too massive to comprehend. Then the polished veneer of high society completely shattered. The distinguished men and women who had spent the evening sipping fine wine suddenly transformed into a desperate, angry mob. Chairs scraped violently against the marble floor as dozens of people stood up at once. The furious, distinguished man in the gray suit who had first checked his banking app marched directly toward the head table, his face a mask of absolute rage. He bypassed me entirely, completely ignoring the woman they had all been mocking just an hour ago, and headed straight for Richard. He was followed by 4 prominent investors rapidly scrolling through their frozen digital portfolios. Richard took a staggering step backward, bumping into the heavy oak serving credenza behind him. The arrogant patriarch who had built his identity on commanding every room he entered now looked like a cornered animal. The men closing in on him were his golfing partners, his country club peers, and the very people whose money he had recklessly gambled away to fund his family vanity. "What exactly did you do with my retirement fund, Richard?" the man in the gray suit demanded, stopping just inches from Richard. "You looked me in the eye last month and told me your expansion was fully funded. You told me my capital was secured in commercial real estate. Where is my money?" Richard raised his hands in a weak defensive gesture, his chest heaving as he struggled to find the confident, booming voice that had never failed him before. "Gentlemen, please," he stammered, a thick bead of sweat rolling down his cheek. "We can discuss this rationally." There has simply been a temporary restructuring of corporate assets. I assure you that every single dollar is accounted for in the long-term projections. Do not insult our intelligence, a woman in a dark emerald evening gown shouted, pushing her way through the growing crowd around him. She shoved her phone directly into his face. My wealth management firm just confirmed the accounts are locked by an external private equity firm. You stole from us to pay for this absurd $60,000 dinner. The shouts grew louder, overlapping and echoing off the vaulted ceilings of the dining hall. The investors cornered Richard at the back of the room, trapping him against the wood-paneled wall. They demanded their money back, their voices raw with panic and betrayal. Richard shrank back, his broad shoulders slumping as the barrage of angry accusations hit him from all sides. He had no answers for them. He had no more lies to spin. The golden parachute he had relied upon had been completely shredded, and the men demanding accountability were powerful enough to ensure he would face severe legal consequences for his profound financial negligence. He was hyperventilating, his eyes darting frantically, looking for a way out that simply did not exist. While Richard was being verbally dismantled by his former business partners, Barbara was experiencing her own terrifying descent into reality. She had spent decades meticulously cultivating her position within the elite social circle of the city. She had hosted the right charity galas, worn the right designer labels, and carefully gate-kept her social group to ensure only the wealthiest and most influential women were allowed into her orbit. Now she desperately needed that manufactured loyalty to save her from the humiliating truth. She turned away from the shouting investors and rushed toward the prime tables near the center of the room where her closest country club friends were gathered. "Margaret, please tell them this is all a ridiculous mistake," Barbara pleaded, reaching out to grab the arm of a wealthy socialite wearing a diamond tennis bracelet. Margaret had been Barbara's frequent tennis partner and confidant for over 15 years. They had spent countless afternoons drinking mimosas and judging the newer members of their club. But as Barbara reached for her, Margaret took a deliberate step backward. She smoothly pulled her arm out of Barbara's grasp, her expression shifting from polite concern to icy detachment. "I think you need to give us some space," Margaret said, her voice dropping to a cool, dismissive register. "My husband has significant capital tied up in Richard's company, and we need to contact our legal team immediately." Barbara gasped, her hand flying to her chest as if she had been physically struck. "Margaret, you cannot be serious," she cried, her voice cracking with mounting hysteria. "We are family friends. We are hosting the spring gala together next month. You know Richard is an honest man." "I do not know anything of the sort," Margaret replied sharply, turning her back on Barbara and signaling for her husband to gather their coats. "It seems none of us knew who your family truly was. Please do not contact me until this mess is sorted out." The rejection was swift and absolute. Barbara turned frantically to the other women at the table, women she had considered her closest allies, but they all mirrored Margaret's cold behavior. They averted their eyes, whispering quietly among themselves as they gathered their expensive evening bags. The elite social circle. Barbara had spent her entire adult life clawing her way into instantly alienated her. They closed ranks, protecting their own wealth and reputations by entirely cutting off the infected limb. Barbara stood alone in the center of the room, her diamond necklace suddenly looking heavy and garish around her neck. The realization that her friendships were as hollow and transactional as her husband's business deals washed over her, leaving her trembling and utterly isolated. The absolute destruction of the family image was happening simultaneously on all fronts. While Richard was cornered by furious investors and Barbara was being shunned by her high society friends, Bianca was having a complete emotional breakdown near the spilled red wine at the head table. The acquisition notice I had handed her was crumpled in her shaking fists. She had spent her entire adult life relying on the endless flow of cash from her father to fund her extravagant lifestyle. She had never worked a real job, never balanced a genuine budget, and never faced a single consequence for her immense financial irresponsibility. Now the safety net was gone. "No, no, no," Bianca chanted, her voice escalating into a frantic wail. She dropped to her knees on the cold marble floor, oblivious to the damage she was doing to her expensive designer gown. She was staring at the crumpled paper, her carefully applied makeup running down her cheeks in dark, muddy streaks. My boutique, she sobbed, rocking slightly back and forth. My sports car, the lease on my apartment. Dad promised he would cover the lease. How am I supposed to pay for anything? I do not know how to manage a store without the corporate credit card. She looked up at her brother Preston, who was still standing frozen by his chair. Preston, do something, she shrieked, her voice echoing over the angry shouts of the investors. But Preston could not help her. The golden boy was entirely paralyzed. He had no job, no money, and no loft to return to. The illusion of the untouchable wealthy American family was entirely dismantled in minutes. Barbara watched her daughter collapse onto the floor, but she did not move to comfort her. Her eyes were wide and frantic, darting wildly around the room as she witnessed the absolute destruction of her carefully constructed reality. The wealthy investors she had spent years brown-nosing were actively shoving past her husband, demanding their money back. The women she considered her closest allies were pretending she did not exist. Her perfect son was paralyzed with fear, and her daughter was wailing over a ruined boutique. But instead of accepting the undeniable truth staring her in the face, Barbara chose delusion. She turned her frantic gaze back to me, and the sheer panic in her eyes instantly morphed into a toxic, burning hatred. She could not accept that a woman she viewed as completely beneath her had dismantled her entire life. Her breathing became shallow and rapid as she struggled to comprehend the magnitude of her downfall. Her hands curled into tight fists at her sides. She took a step toward me, her diamond heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. "You did this!" she screamed, her voice tearing through the chaotic noise of the crowded room. "You manipulated all of this because you are jealous of us. You are nothing but pathetic trash from the gutter, and you are trying to drag my family down to your miserable level." She took another slow, deliberate step, her face twisting into a grotesque mask of unhinged fury and sheer absolute desperate madness. She had lost her social standing, her wealth and her friends in a matter of minutes, and her fragile mind could not process the devastation. The only defense mechanism she had left was pure, unadulterated rage. I stood perfectly still, watching her unravel. I did not flinch or step back. I just looked at her with a calm, empty expression that only seemed to fuel her escalating madness. "I am going to destroy you!" Barbara shrieked. She completely lost whatever tiny shred of composure she had left. She lunged at me across the short distance separating us. Her arms were raised, her manicured fingers curled like claws, aiming directly for my face. It was a desperate, unhinged attack from a woman who had never been held accountable for her actions in her entire life. She expected me to cower, to shrink away in fear, just like she had forced me to do for the past 3 years. But I was no longer the quiet, obedient fiancé trying to keep the peace. I saw her moving long before she crossed the space. As her hand swung toward me, I did not retreat. I stepped forward, planting my feet firmly on the marble floor. With a swift, calculated motion, I raised my right hand and caught her thin wrist mid-air. The hard impact sent a very sharp crack echoing through our immediate area. My grip was like a solid steel vise, locking her arm perfectly in place, inches from my face. Barbara gasped in profound shock. Her forward momentum was instantly halted. She yanked her arm, trying frantically to pull away, but I tightened my hold, refusing to yield a single inch. The sudden physical dominance completely shattered her aggressive burst of energy. She stared at me, her eyes wide with disbelief, realizing that I was physically stronger and vastly more composed than she could ever hope to be. The investors standing nearest to us stopped shouting for a brief moment, turning their heads to watch the wealthy matriarch being effortlessly restrained by the woman she had mocked all evening. "Let go of me," she demanded, her voice dropping to a panicked whisper as she struggled against my firm grip. "You are hurting me. I am barely touching you, Barbara," I said, keeping my voice dangerously low and steady. "But I want you to listen to me very carefully, because I am only going to say this once." She stopped struggling, breathing heavily, her chest heaving under her expensive silk gown. Her eyes darted around, looking for someone to intervene, but Preston was still frozen, and Richard was entirely consumed by his furious creditors. She was completely alone. Do you remember the first day we met, Barbara? I asked, my voice cutting through the ambient noise like a perfectly sharpened blade. Do you remember the first time Preston brought me to your estate for brunch? She blinked, trying to maintain her glare, but the fear was obvious in her trembling jaw. I arrived early that day. I continued holding her wrist firmly so she could not look away. I wanted to make a good impression. I wore a floral dress I bought at a thrift store. It was clean but obviously not a designer label. When I walked up to your door, you opened it before I could even ring the bell. You looked me up and down, taking in my simple clothes and my worn shoes. Do you remember what you said to me? She swallowed hard, refusing to answer. You did not even say hello, I reminded her, the memory burning bright in my mind. You did not welcome me into your home. You looked at me with absolute disgust, and you told me that the delivery personnel were required to use the servant entrance at the back of the house. You assumed I was the help because I was not dripping in expensive diamonds. And when Preston finally came to the door and introduced me as his new girlfriend, you did not apologize. You just laughed that awful, condescending laugh and told him he had a terrible habit of picking up strays. I took a slow, deliberate breath, letting the reality of the past sink into the present moment. You spent the next 3 years treating me like an unwanted pest. You mocked my clothes, my car, and my lack of a trust fund. You constantly told Preston he needed to upgrade to a woman of true substance. You thought my thrift store clothes meant I was poor. You thought my quiet demeanor meant I was weak. You thought I was just a desperate girl trying to cling to your family wealth. I leaned in slightly, closing the distance between us until I could see the tiny lines of panic etched around her eyes. I wore those thrifted clothes for a reason, Barbara. I whispered, my voice cold and unyielding. I wore them because I wanted to test you. I wanted to see if this family had even a single ounce of genuine character. I tightened my grip on her wrist for one final second before releasing it completely. She stumbled backward, rubbing her arm, her face flushed with deep, profound humiliation. You failed, Barbara, I said. Every single one of you failed the test spectacularly. You proved that beneath your expensive clothes and your country club memberships, you are absolutely hollow. You built your entire identity on a mountain of toxic debt and stolen money. And the moment someone stopped pretending you were royalty, your entire world collapsed. Barbara stood there shivering in her designer gown. She looked utterly broken. The fierce, arrogant woman who had terrorized me for years was entirely gone, replaced by a pathetic shell of a person who had just realized she had nothing left to hide behind. The realization washed over her, leaving her completely speechless. I turned away from her, dismissing her existence entirely. I walked back toward the head table. The truth was out, and absolute justice was finally mine. The chaotic noise faded to a dull roar as I reached my seat. Preston remained where I left him, but his pristine image had dissolved. The arrogant boy who treated my career like a hobby was trembling. He looked at his mother sobbing, and his father backed into a corner by furious investors. His reality was crashing down. He had no trust fund left. The panic in his eyes was replaced by sickening clarity. He realized the only person holding actual power was the woman he intended to force into a prenuptial agreement. I took a hesitant step toward me, looking at the angry crowd and his socially exiled family. Then he made a decision, revealing the absolute rot at his core. He fell to his knees on the cold marble floor and grabbed the hem of my skirt, his knuckles white. "Penelope, please," he begged, his voice cracking loudly for the onlookers to hear every pathetic syllable. "You have to listen to me. I had no idea they were in this much debt. I swear I did not know what my father was doing." I stared down at him, feeling profound revulsion. "Let go of my skirt, Preston," I commanded with lethal authority. He released the fabric but did not stand. He kept his knees firmly planted, looking up with terrified eyes. "You cannot do this to me, Penelope," he pleaded, tears streaming down his moisturized cheeks. "We love each other. We are supposed to get married tomorrow. We do not need my parents. We have your firm. We can leave them behind." A collective gasp echoed from the closest tables. Preston was throwing his entire family to the wolves in a desperate bid to secure his financial survival. He was publicly abandoning the parents who spoiled him his entire life, simply because their bank accounts were frozen. I leaned forward, resting my hands on the silk tablecloth. "You want to marry me?" I asked, keeping my tone dangerously even. "You want to marry the woman your family spent the evening mocking?" "Yes," Preston cried eagerly, nodding so hard his styled hair flopped over his forehead. "Yes, I do. I love you. I do not care about them anymore. They lied to me just like they lied to you. They are toxic. We can cut them off completely. I will never speak to my parents or Bianca ever again. I promise you. Just please do not leave me with nothing. Please spare my accounts. Let me stay with you. I will do whatever you want." The silence falling over our section was heavier and more oppressive than anything that had occurred previously. Richard, still trapped against the wall by angry creditors, turned his head just in time to hear his only son offer to discard him entirely. The devastation crossing the older man's face was tragic. He committed massive fraud to maintain an empire for a son who was currently begging for an allowance. Barbara stopped rubbing her injured wrist and stared at Preston in complete horror. Her flawless, handsome prince was groveling on the floor like a desperate stray animal. I searched his tear-stained face for a single microscopic trace of genuine affection or remorse. There was nothing. There was only the terrifying panic of a parasite that just realized its host was dead and needed to attach itself to a new source of survival. "You are truly pathetic, Preston," I said, the disgust in my voice ringing clear. "You spent 3 years letting your mother humiliate me. You let your father demand I sign a prenup to protect a legacy that did not exist. You sat there laughing while they treated me like garbage." "I did not mean to," he sobbed, reaching out to grab my hand. I pulled away sharply. "Do not touch me," I snapped. "You do not love me, Preston. You love the lifestyle you thought I was desperate to marry into. Now that you realize I hold the cards, you are ready to throw your family under the bus, just to keep yourself dressed in designer suits." I looked out at the guests, watching the display with revulsion. "I want everyone in this room to look closely at the golden boy of the Addams family. Look at the loyalty of the man you were supposed to respect." Preston buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with pathetic sobs. He had completely abandoned whatever shred of dignity he had left. There was no coming back from this immense public humiliation. He had shown his true colors to the most influential people in the city. He would never be welcomed in their social circles again. He was exposed as a spineless coward who cared about no one but himself. I felt the final lingering ties to my past completely sever. I was entirely free. "I am not marrying you tomorrow, Preston," I said, delivering the crushing blow to his shattered ego. "I am not marrying you ever. I am calling off the wedding effective immediately. And since I will never again use my money to shield you from the consequences of your choices, I suggest you start looking for a very cheap apartment. You are completely bankrupt in every possible sense of the word." Preston let out a wretched wailing sound and curled into a tight ball on the floor. He wept loudly and uncontrollably, a grown man crying over the loss of his trust fund, while his family watched in horrified silence. The investors shook their heads in absolute disgust, turning their attention back to the financial crisis at hand. The chaotic noise of the room began to swell once more as the shouts and demands for accountability resumed with greater ferocity. I stood tall amidst the chaos, feeling a profound sense of calm wash over me. The storm was raging all around me, but I was the one who conjured it. I had survived their cruelty and orchestrated their absolute downfall with perfect precision. I reached down to gather my black folder of financial documents, preparing to make my final exit from the country club. There was nothing left for me to do here. The hostile takeover was complete, and the family was destroyed. But before I could turn to leave, the heavy double doors at the back of the elegant dining hall suddenly swung open with a loud, forceful bang that cut through the rising clamor. I paused, my hand resting on my folder, and looked toward the back of the room. Pushing his way through the chaotic crowd of shouting millionaires was the country club maitre d'. He usually navigated the dining room with invisible grace, but tonight he was marching with a stiff, urgent stride, his face pale and incredibly grim. He dodged past a furious board member and sidestepped a spilled tray of champagne glasses, never breaking his intense pace. In his right hand, held tightly against his chest, was a slim black leather check presenter. It was the standard folder used to deliver bills to the tables at the end of an evening. But the way he gripped it suggested it contained something far more significant than a simple tally of the dinner courses. The crowd seemed to part for him instinctively, sensing the dark urgency radiating from his tense posture. He ignored the shouting matches at the prime tables and walked directly toward the head table. His eyes locked onto the spot where Preston was sobbing on the floor and where I was standing. He stopped just short of the spilled red wine, looking down at the ruined family, before slowly extending the black leather folder outward. The maitre d' stood before us, his polished black shoes planted firmly on the spilled red wine soaking into the marble. He held the black leather check presenter extended in his right hand directly toward Richard. The angry murmurs of the cornered investors slowly died down, replaced by a new kind of tension. They all knew what that black folder represented. The lavish $60,000 rehearsal dinner had to be paid for. Richard stared at the presenter as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike. He raised a trembling hand and tried to wave the man away. He was attempting to summon a fraction of his usual country club arrogance. "Put it on my house account," he muttered, his voice hoarse and broken. "I will settle the monthly tab on Monday morning as I always do. Just leave us alone right now." But the maitre d' did not move. He did not bow or step backward or offer his usual deferential smile. He kept his arm fully extended, the black leather folder hovering inches from the chest of the ruined patriarch. "I am afraid that is no longer possible, sir," the maitre d' said, his voice projecting. He spoke clearly across the suddenly quiet dining room. "I was instructed by the general manager to bring this to you immediately. The credit card we have on file for your private event has been declined. Furthermore, we received a notification from our financial processing system that your house account has been permanently suspended." A collective gasp rippled through the prime tables. The distinguished guests who had just discovered their investment portfolios were tied to a bankrupt company were now witnessing the immediate practical humiliation of a declined credit card. It was one thing to hear about corporate debt and asset seizures in the abstract. It was an entirely different reality to watch a man who claimed to be a titan of industry get his card rejected at a luxury country club dinner. Richard blinked rapidly, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. "Declined," he repeated, the words sounding foreign on his tongue. "That is impossible. Try it again. It is a premium corporate card. It has no limit." I glanced down at my watch and smiled. It was exactly 7:45 in the evening. My legal team had executed the formal asset freeze at precisely 7 o'clock sharp. The timing was absolutely flawless. By the time the kitchen staff had started clearing the main course plates, every single bank account, offshore reserve, and corporate credit line tied to the logistics company had been completely locked down. Richard did not have a premium corporate card anymore. He had a useless piece of plastic. "I tried to process it 3 separate times, sir," the maitre d' explained, his tone remaining perfectly professional but devoid of any warmth. Each attempt returned the same error code, indicating the account has been frozen by an external financial institution. Richard frantically reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a sleek designer wallet. His fingers fumbled as he pulled out a personal platinum card and practically shoved it into the chest of the waiting man. "Use this one then," Richard demanded, sweat pouring down his forehead. "Run it right now and clear the balance." The maitre d' accepted the card with a slight nod and pulled a handheld digital payment terminal from his apron pocket. He slid the platinum card through the reader. The machine beeped a harsh negative tone. "Declined," the maitre d' announced flatly. Richard pulled out another card entirely, a personal debit card tied to a local bank. He handed it over, his breathing becoming shallow and erratic. The maitre d' swiped it. The machine beeped again. "Declined." One by one, Richard pulled out every single card in his expensive leather wallet. He offered a secondary corporate card, a joint account card he shared with Barbara, and even a low-limit emergency credit card. Every single attempt was met with the exact same harsh electronic rejection. The asset freeze was comprehensive and absolute. There was not a single penny left for him to access. The reality of the situation settled heavily over the head table. The lavish rehearsal dinner they had spent the evening enjoying was suddenly an unpaid debt. The $60,000 bill covered an absurd amount of luxury. It covered the imported beluga caviar served during the cocktail hour and the vintage champagne flowing freely into crystal flutes. It paid for the elaborate floral centerpieces featuring rare orchids imported specifically for the occasion. It covered the prime cuts of filet mignon, the customized dessert bar, and the string quartet that had been playing softly in the corner before the chaos erupted. They had consumed all of it, and now they had absolutely no way to pay for it. "I am very sorry, sir," the maitre d' said, slipping the handheld terminal back into his apron. "But the total balance for tonight is exactly $60,000. The general manager has instructed me to inform you that we require immediate alternate payment. We cannot allow you or your family to leave the premises until this massive bill is settled in full. If you are unable to provide a valid form of payment tonight, we will be forced to contact the local authorities and file a formal report for theft of services." The threat of police involvement caused a new wave of panic to wash over Richard. He looked completely defeated. He had spent his entire life leveraging debt to project an image of untouchable wealth, and now he was facing the prospect of being arrested for failing to pay a restaurant bill. He looked frantically at the angry investors surrounding him, silently pleading for someone to step in and offer a loan to cover the dinner. But the wealthy men and women simply glared back at him, their arms crossed over their chests. They already lost millions to his fraudulent logistics empire. Not a single person in that room was going to offer him a dime to save him from a night in a jail cell. Barbara, who had been standing frozen near the spilled wine, suddenly stepped forward. Her fragile mind had clearly reached its breaking point. She had lost her social standing, her wealth, and her carefully curated country club friendships in a matter of minutes. The threat of her husband being arrested over a declined credit card was the final mental snap she could endure. But instead of accepting the reality of their profound poverty, Barbara retreated deep into a state of delusional entitlement. She refused to believe that the rules of consequence applied to a family as important as hers. She adjusted the heavy diamond necklace resting against her collarbone and lifted her chin, adopting the haughty, arrogant posture she had used to terrorize me for the past 3 years. She looked at the maitre d' with absolute disdain, as if he were a peasant daring to question the authority of a queen. "There is absolutely no need to involve the police," Barbara said, her voice dripping with extreme condescension. She waved her manicured hand dismissively. She turned and locked her furious gaze entirely on me. "You owe us for ruining the evening," Barbara haughtily commanded, pointing a sharp finger directly at my chest. "You will pay for this dinner immediately. Clear the balance right now with your corporate credit card, Penelope." For a long moment I stared at the finger pointed at my chest. Barbara was trembling with rage and profound denial. She honestly believed she could order me to cover a $60,000 bill after trying to destroy my dignity all evening. She expected me to rescue the very people who demanded I sign away 80% of my future income. The breathtaking audacity hung heavy in the air. I looked at Richard sweating through his suit and Preston kneeling pathetically on the marble floor. And then I laughed. It started as a soft chuckle, but quickly grew into a genuine ringing laugh that echoed off the high ceilings. It was a laugh of absolute liberation. The sound unnerved Barbara more than any anger could have. "What is so funny?" Barbara hissed, her voice trembling. "This is not a joke, Penelope. You are going to pay for this dinner right now, or I will personally ensure you are thrown in a jail cell." I picked up my worn leather tote bag, the very bag they had been mocking. I slung the strap over my shoulder and smoothed the front of my vintage dress. "You are forgetting a crucial detail, Barbara," I said clearly. "I owe you absolutely nothing. I called off the wedding 10 minutes ago. I am no longer your future daughter-in-law. And according to the loud public speech you gave this evening, I am not real family." Barbara opened her mouth to argue, but no words came out. Her face flushed crimson as her own cruel insults were weaponized against her. "You made it abundantly clear that I do not belong in your opulent world." I continued pacing slowly. "You spent 3 years reminding me that I was an outsider. You handed me a prenuptial agreement to ensure I would never touch your wealth. This massive debt belongs entirely to you." Preston scrambled to his feet, his suit stained with spilled wine. Penelope, please, he begged, reaching out toward me. You cannot leave us here. They are going to arrest my parents. I do not have a single dollar to my name. You have to pay this bill. I looked at the man I had once loved, feeling nothing but profound pity. You should have thought about that before you told me to sign away my future, just to keep the peace, Preston, I said coldly. You made your bed and now you get to lie in it. Barbara spun around wildly, her eyes locking onto the maitre d' holding the check presenter. Do not just stand there, she shrieked. Stop her. She is the one who caused this mess. Make her pay the bill or call the police on her. The maitre d' did not move a muscle to block my path. Instead, he looked at Barbara with utter disdain. That was the other fatal mistake the Addams family made. They assumed wealth commanded automatic respect and treated the service staff like invisible furniture. But I had spent 6 months planning this dinner. I had learned the maitre d' was named Julian. I treated every bartender, waiter, and security guard with genuine kindness. And more importantly, I tipped them massively in cash. They knew exactly who I was and how horribly the Addams family treated me. Julian turned his attention to me, his grim expression replaced by a warm, professional smile. Miss Penelope, he said, offering a slight respectful bow. Is there anything else we can assist you with this evening? No, thank you, Julian, I replied, smiling back. The food was absolutely exquisite. It was our pleasure, he said, stepping back and gesturing toward the main exit. Have a wonderful and safe evening. He signaled with his hand, and the staff instantly sprang into action. The waiters moved in perfect synchronization, parting, like the Red Sea, to create a clear path for me toward the heavy oak double doors. They stood tall, offering small nods of respect as I prepared to make my exit. Barbara let out an inhuman shriek of pure frustration. You cannot do this, she screamed, lunging forward to grab my arm. Stop her right now. She never made it more than 3 steps. As soon as she moved aggressively, 2 massive country club security guards in crisp dark suits stepped firmly out from the shadows. They moved with terrifying speed, ignoring me as I walked past them, and formed a solid physical wall between the Addams family and the exit. Excuse me, madam, one of the guards said, his deep voice booming with authority. He held up a hand, halting Barbara in her tracks. You need to step back and remain exactly where you are. We are leaving, Richard yelled, trying to push past the guard. We are elite members of this club. Not anymore, sir, Julian stated, standing behind the security blockade. Your membership was automatically revoked, and you are not leaving this room until the $60,000 balance is settled in full. I do not have the money, Richard roared. My accounts are frozen. You cannot keep us hostage. We are not keeping you hostage, sir, Julian replied, his tone polite but lethal. We have already contacted the local authorities regarding the massive theft of services. The police have been dispatched and are currently en route. You will remain in this dining hall until they arrive to process the charges. The word police sent a shockwave of terror through the remaining members of the Addams family. Bianca, who had been sobbing quietly, suddenly wailed loudly, clutching her ruined designer dress. The pampered socialite was about to be put in the back of a squad car. Preston collapsed backward into his chair, burying his face in his hands as he sobbed uncontrollably, his pristine image entirely destroyed. Richard stumbled backward, hitting the edge of the dining table, his chest heaving as the wealthy investors he had defrauded began to shout at him, demanding their stolen money. And Barbara, the arrogant, vicious matriarch, stood completely frozen. Her arms fell limply to her sides. She stared at the imposing security guards blocking her exit, and the reality of her profound downfall finally shattered her delusional mind. She had no money, she had no friends, she had no social standing. She was a bankrupt woman facing criminal charges in the country club she had once ruled. She looked at me one last time through the gap between the security guards. There was only absolute devastating despair. She tried to strip away my dignity and lost absolutely everything. I did not offer her a parting word. I turned my back on the ruined family and continued walking down the aisle. My tote bag bumped against my hip. I pushed open the heavy oak double doors and stepped out into the grand lobby, leaving the shouts and chaos completely behind me. The night air was cool as I walked out the doors and stepped onto the paved valet lot. I took a deep, cleansing breath, filling my lungs with the sweet scent of absolute freedom. My 10-year-old Honda Civic was waiting for me. As I reached into my purse to pull out my car keys, a distant sound drifted through the night air. The high-pitched wail of police sirens echoed in the distance, growing steadily louder with each passing second. The authorities were arriving. The hostile takeover was complete, and my future was finally my own. Exactly 6 months later, the cool, biting air of that Chicago night felt like a distant lifetime away. I sat comfortably behind a massive glass desk in my sleek, high-rise corner office, overlooking the sprawling downtown skyline. The morning sun was pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows, bathing the pristine modern space in a warm, golden glow. I took a slow, deliberate sip from my ceramic coffee mug, savoring the rich, dark roast and the profound quiet that accompanied it. There were no arrogant demands echoing down the hall. There were no condescending remarks about my wardrobe or my background. There was only the gentle ambient hum of the city far below, and the soft professional voices of my dedicated staff, moving efficiently outside my closed door. I leaned back into my leather chair, letting the absolute tranquility of my new reality wash over me completely. Mounted on the wall directly across from my desk was a large flat-screen television. It was permanently tuned to a prominent financial news network, playing softly in the background as I started my daily routine. I watched as the sleek graphics flashed across the screen, transitioning to their top-breaking story of the morning. The headline banner displayed in bold red letters detailed the final devastating chapter of the Addams family logistics empire. The anchor spoke with crisp, professional authority, outlining the federal indictment of Richard Addams for massive corporate fraud and extensive financial conspiracy. The news segment displayed footage of Richard being escorted into a courthouse, his once pristine tailored suit looking rumpled and ill-fitting on his visibly aged frame. The broadcast confirmed the total absolute liquidation of all his personal and corporate assets to repay the furious investors he had swindled for decades. Howe was facing significant prison time and his empire was reduced to mere ashes. The devastating fallout had not spared the rest of his family in the slightest. According to the subsequent news reports and the quiet whispers of the Chicago business elite, Barbara had been forced to immediately vacate their sprawling, opulent estate. The grand house with the servant entrance she had once so proudly defended had been seized by federal authorities and sold at a public auction. Barbara was currently living in a cramped, incredibly modest apartment on the outskirts of the city, completely exiled from the high society country club circles she had once ruled with an iron fist. Her so-called friends had universally abandoned her the very moment her bank accounts were frozen. Bianca had fared no better. Her boutique was instantly shuttered, and her luxury sports car was repossessed, leaving the pampered golden daughter to finally navigate a harsh reality she was entirely unprepared to survive on her own. But the most profound karmic justice was reserved for Preston. The man who had demanded I sign a prenuptial agreement to protect his imaginary wealth was currently working a minimum wage job just to survive. The financial industry had completely blacklisted him following the spectacular public collapse of his father. With no trust fund and a mountain of personal legal fees stemming from the chaotic country club incident and the massive theft of services charges, Preston was forced to take a position stocking shelves at a local hardware store. He spent his days wearing a polyester uniform, sweeping floors and taking orders from managers half his age. The arrogant, handsome prince who had once looked down on my career ambitions was now desperately living paycheck to paycheck, his manufactured identity entirely dismantled and shattered beyond repair. I slowly shifted my attention away from the television screen and focused on the thick black folder resting neatly on my desk. It contained the thick stack of finalized paperwork for my firm's very next multi-million-dollar corporate acquisition. I picked up my favorite heavy silver pen and slowly began reviewing the incredibly complex legal documents with precise expert focus. I paused for a single quiet moment, looking out at the endless horizon stretching across the beautiful city. A soft, genuine smile spread across my face as the absolute magnitude of my victory settled deep into my soul. I did not just escape a truly highly toxic family. I meticulously orchestrated their absolute karmic ruin and permanently secured my unshakable freedom. I signed my name on the dotted line, sealing another incredibly lucrative deal. The past was entirely dead, and my own brilliantly bright future was finally waiting for me to claim it. The story we just witnessed is more than just a dramatic tale of sweet revenge. It is a profound lesson in recognizing our own inherent value and the importance of unwavering boundaries. When Penelope stood her ground against Preston and his family, she demonstrated that true power does not come from inherited wealth or societal status, but from self-respect and strategic independence. For years, Penelope faced the Addams family's relentless cruelty, enduring their attempts to cast her as an unworthy outsider. Yet instead of internalizing their toxic narrative or begging for their acceptance, she quietly built her own empire. Her journey teaches us that when people underestimate you or attempt to strip away your dignity, you do not need to seek their approval. Instead, your best response is to cultivate your own success in silence. You must remember that you owe absolutely nothing to those who only value you when it serves their own selfish interests. Furthermore, the story highlights the destructive nature of entitlement. Preston and his family built their entire identities on a fragile foundation of deceit and arrogance. When the truth was finally revealed, their lack of genuine character led to their absolute public downfall. True security is never found in tearing others down. It is built through hard work, integrity, and authentic self-reliance. Penelope did not just escape a toxic situation, she meticulously reclaimed her future by refusing to play a supporting role in someone else's delusion. Have you ever found yourself seeking validation from people who constantly overlook your true worth? Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic environment to finally build the life you deserve? Share your own stories of reclaiming your power in the comments below. If Penelope's journey to unshakable freedom resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe for more empowering stories of resilience and sweet vindication.